Imagine you wake up one morning and the world is on the brink of nuclear war. How would you feel? People have experienced the same thing. And what really happened in 1962? What caused it? Grab your coffee and enjoy the video before we move on. The year 1962 is known as one of the most dangerous periods in world history. Tensions between the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other came to a head because of nuclear missiles deployed in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted only 13 days, but those 13 days changed the fate of the world forever. Now, let's go into some detail. Soviet missiles had been deployed in Cuba and were ready to fire. This information came as a great shock to the US administration. Kennedy immediately summoned his closest advisors, and a series of secret meetings were held. In these meetings, they discussed what should be done. Options included a military attack on Cuba, a naval blockade, or direct negotiations with the Soviet Union. But each option carried the risk of leading to a nuclear war, and Kennedy first opted for a naval blockade rather than military intervention. On October 22nd, he would make a public speech. When the dates came to October 22nd, in a national address to the American people, he announced a quarantine around Cuba. The aim was to prevent Soviet ships from carrying more weapons to Cuba. Following this step, Kennedy appealed to world leaders to keep the peace. But instead of backing down, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, characterized the quarantine as a declaration of war, and world tensions continued to rise. And what would happen after that? The world held its breath. After Kennedy's national address, the American Navy moved to intercept Soviet ships approaching Cuba. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union directed its warships to the area. As both sides debated whether to open fire on each other, the world was just seconds away from the outbreak of a nuclear war. The most critical moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred on October 27, 1962. On that day, a submarine belonging to the Soviet Union was spotted by the American Navy and forced to surface by depth charges. The submarine was armed with nuclear torpedoes, and the crew, believing that war had begun, considered using these weapons. But at the last moment, the captain of the submarine took control of the situation and prevented the nuclear torpedoes from being fired. If these weapons had been fired, the world would probably have gone down a path of no return. Now let's go back in history to 1959. Things would change in 1959 when communist revolutionary Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba. The communist victory came as a shock to us officials because for the last 30 years, Cuba had been a popular vacation destination for wealthy Americans. They would come here, take their vacations and leave. And by the 1950s, much of the Cuban economy was under American control. But all that would change when Castro came to power. The American-owned banks, casinos, coffee, and sugar plantations would be nationalized. Castro eventually turned to the Soviet Union for help and protection. Afterwards, John F. Kennedy became president in 1961. But as soon as he took office, he was under enormous pressure to deal with the Cuban problem and launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, just 4 months after taking office. 1,500 Cuban exiles, trained by the CIA, invaded the island in an attempt to overthrow Castro and eliminate communism in Cuba. But the invasion turned into a disaster. The exiles found little support among the Cuban people and were quickly trapped by Castro's forces. Seeking to conceal American intervention, Kennedy refused to authorize us air support, leading to the surrender of the invaders after only 3 days. This was an embarrassing start to Kennedy's presidency. Here we are again, October 27th. October 27 is also known as Black Saturday, because on that day the world came very close to the start of a nuclear war. The day would begin with Castro composing a letter to Khrushchev urging him to consider a nuclear first strike against the United States. He was fully convinced that an American invasion was imminent and wanted his Soviet allies to deliver the first blow. Unlike Castro, Khrushchev still believed there was time to negotiate. He sent Kennedy a second proposal, specifying what he would accept in a deal. Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba if Kennedy would do the same in Turkey. The letter would eventually be accepted, but before Kennedy could respond, another Soviet submarine would be involved in a dangerous confrontation with American forces. In what became known as the U-2 incident, an American spy plane was accidentally shot down over Cuba. Pilot Rudolph Anderson was killed instantly. But the incident almost led to a nuclear confrontation. Kennedy would initially refuse to publicly acknowledge the U-2 incident, to prevent Khrushchev from thinking that the American military was using it as a pretext for invasion. On the same day, a Soviet submarine stationed off the coast of Cuba would find itself under attack by American warships. The submarine B-59 was carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo and was already under pressure from American depth charges. Valentin Savitsky, the captain of the B-59, had no way of knowing whether the attack was the beginning of a full-scale invasion or a tactic to force them to the surface. Savitsky and his crew were under enormous pressure. They had no idea what to do. With all communication systems disabled, Savitsky felt he had no choice but to launch the torpedo, believing the battle had begun. But as he was about to give the order, an officer intervened and argued that they should wait for official orders from Moscow. In the end, the officer's advice proved to be correct. The captain reluctantly agreed to stop, and the crisis continued. By the end of October 1962, the world was left with a crisis that brought humanity to the brink of destruction. By October 28, Khrushchev would announce that he would withdraw the missiles from Cuba, thus neutralizing the situation. Kennedy and Khrushchev would reach a secret agreement to remove US missiles from Turkey. Finally, on October 28, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States pledged to dismantle its nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, and not to intervene militarily in Cuba. This secret agreement averted a nuclear catastrophe in the world. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as the most dangerous event of the Cold War, it had lasting effects on the world. First, it taught world leaders a lesson about how destructive nuclear weapons can be. Second, it led to the establishment of a direct line of communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. This direct telephone line, known as the Red Line, allowed leaders to communicate directly in emergencies. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most critical moments in human history. Coming back from the brink of nuclear war once again demonstrated both the prudence of world leaders and the power of diplomacy. That's all for today's video. See you soon.